I should have known that a house this beautiful, priced this low, in a neighborhood this quiet, was too good to be true. The moment I pulled my moving truck onto the pristine asphalt of Silver Oaks Lane, I felt the weight of a dozen different gazes pressing against the tinted glass of my windshield. It wasn't the welcoming stare of curious neighbors hoping for a new friend, but rather the cold, analytical observation of a predator watching a new animal enter its territory. I remember stepping out into the humid evening air, the silence of the cul-de-sac so absolute that the clicking of my car alarm sounded like a gunshot echoing through the manicured trees. Standing there on my new lawn, I noticed the first red flag that I would later regret ignoring with such naive confidence. Every single house on the street had its blinds pulled exactly halfway down, creating a uniform, hooded appearance that made the buildings look like they were squinting at me. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself that this was just the culture of an upscale, private community where people valued their seclusion above all else. But as I began to unload the first of my boxes, I saw a man standing on the porch of the house directly across from mine, perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched me struggle with a heavy oak dresser. He didn't wave, he didn't offer to help, and he didn't move for the entire 45 minutes it took me to clear the back of the truck. The first night in a new house is always filled with strange sounds, but these weren't the settling of wood or the humming of a refrigerator. Around 2 in the morning, I was jolted awake by a faint, rhythmic scratching coming from the front door, a sound so deliberate that it made the hair on my arms stand straight up. I crept down the hallway, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood, and looked through the peephole only to see the empty, moonlit street stretching out into the darkness. When I opened the door the next morning to get the mail, I found a small, jagged piece of white chalk sitting on my welcome mat and a single, perfectly drawn X marked on the bottom corner of my doorframe. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself it was a prank by local teenagers, but the atmosphere in the neighborhood was shifting from cold to openly hostile. Every time I left for work, I would see the same black SUV parked at the end of the street, its engine idling, just waiting for me to pass before it pulled out to follow me for exactly 3 blocks. I started noticing subtle changes around my property that suggested someone was entering my yard while I was away, such as the garden gate being left unlatched or the outdoor sensor lights being unscrewed just enough to lose power. The isolation began to feel like a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of dread that made me double-check the locks on my windows every time I entered a room. The tension reached a breaking point on Friday night, a night when the air felt thick with an approaching storm and the streetlights seemed dimmer than usual. I was sitting in my living room, the only lamp in the house turned on, when I heard the distinct sound of a heavy footstep on my back deck. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I realized that I hadn't seen a single light on in any of the neighboring houses all evening. It was as if the entire street had gone dark in preparation for something, a coordinated blackout that left my house glowing like a beacon in the center of a trap. I reached for my phone, but the screen remained black, the charging cable having been sliced clean through by something sharp enough to leave no frayed edges. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a low, metallic thud coming from the basement, the unmistakable sound of the heavy bulkhead door being forced open from the outside. I didn't scream because I knew that no one on this street was coming to help me. In fact, they were likely the ones standing in the dark watching my windows right now. I grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth and retreated into the kitchen, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps as I heard the basement door creak open. I could hear them whispering now, not one person, but several, their voices a low, unintelligible murmur that moved through my home with a terrifying sense of familiarity. They weren't looking for jewelry or electronics. They were moving through the house like they were inspecting it, opening closets and running their hands along the walls as if I wasn't even there. I realized then that this wasn't a robbery, but a reclaiming, a group of people who believed that this property belonged to their collective and that I was merely a temporary occupant. I retreated further into the shadows of the pantry, my eyes fixed on the kitchen entrance, watching as the first shadow stretched across the tile floor. It was the man from across the street, still wearing the same windbreaker, his face completely devoid of emotion as he held a heavy set of master keys in his hand. "You weren't supposed to stay this long," he whispered into the darkness. his voice calm and terrifyingly reasonable as he stepped into the kitchen. Behind him, two other men appeared, blocking the exits and trapping me in the narrow space between the counters. I realized that my only chance was the small window above the sink, a narrow opening that led out to the side yard where the fence was lowest. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, I swung the fire poker at the nearest man, the heavy iron catching him in the shoulder and buying me the 3 seconds I needed to scramble onto the counter. I shattered the glass of the window with the poker and dove through, ignoring the sharp sting of the shards as they tore through my shirt and skin. I hit the ground hard, rolling into the mulch, and didn't look back as I sprinted toward the perimeter fence of the community. I could hear them behind me, not running or shouting, but walking with the steady, confident pace of people who knew exactly where I was going. I scrambled over the wooden slats of the back fence, falling into the brambles of the public park that bordered the neighborhood, and I kept running until the soles of my feet were raw and the lights of a gas station appeared in the distance. I never went back to that house alone, not even to get my clothes or my furniture. When I returned 2 days later with the police, the house was perfectly clean. The broken window had been replaced with a new pane of glass, and the X on my door had been scrubbed away. The officer sighed as he looked at the empty rooms, telling me that without evidence of a break-in or a struggle, there was nothing he could do but file a report. As I drove away for the final time, I looked up at the house across the street and saw the man standing on his porch, his hands clasped behind his back, watching me go with a look of quiet, chilling satisfaction. I didn't just buy a house. I bought a dead man's entire life, including the heavy mahogany furniture, the tattered wool rugs, and the lingering scent of pipe tobacco that seemed to be baked into the very wallpaper of the master bedroom. The real estate agent called it an as-is estate sale, a rare opportunity for a young buyer to acquire a Victorian-style home at a fraction of its market value, provided I was willing to deal with the mountain of clutter left behind by the late Mr. Abernathy. I remember the first evening I spent alone in the house, sitting on a dusty velvet armchair and looking at the framed photographs of a family I didn't know, feeling less like an owner and more like a ghost haunting someone else's memories. The silence of the house was heavy, a thick and suffocating stillness that made every floorboard groan sound like a deliberate footstep coming from the darkened hallway upstairs. The first week was spent hauling bags of old newspapers and moth-eaten clothes to the curb, but the more I cleared away, the more I felt a prickly sensation on the back of my neck, as if I were being judged for disturbing the peace of the deceased. It started with small things, like finding the basement door standing wide open in the morning even though I distinctly remembered locking it before I went to bed. Then came the phone calls to the landline I hadn't even hooked up yet, a sharp and rhythmic ringing that would stop the very second I stepped into the kitchen to investigate the source of the noise. I tried to tell myself that the old wiring was simply reacting to the damp spring weather, but the logic felt thin and fragile against the growing dread that was beginning to take root in my chest. The atmosphere shifted from unsettling to dangerous on a Tuesday night when the moon was obscured by a thick blanket of fog that turned my backyard into a wall of gray nothingness. I was in the library, sorting through a collection of leather-bound books, when a heavy, brass skeleton key slid across the hardwood floor from the shadows beneath the desk and tapped against my shoe. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up, noting the cold weight of the metal and the small, handwritten tag attached to the ring that simply read, "The Third Step." I stood up, my pulse thundering in my ears, and walked to the grand staircase, my eyes fixed on the third step from the bottom where a faint, hairline fracture in the wood seemed to be glowing under the light of my flashlight. Using a flathead screwdriver, I pried up the board and discovered a small steel lockbox nestled in the insulation, its surface covered in a layer of grime that looked like dried grease. I didn't have time to open it before I heard the sound of a window shattering in the dining room, followed by the heavy, crunching sound of boots stepping over broken glass onto the hardwood floor. I froze, my fingers gripping the cold metal of the lockbox, as I realized that someone hadn't been waiting for me to leave. They had been waiting for me to find exactly what was in my hands. The intruder didn't move like a common thief, but rather with a terrifying, purposeful stride that told me they knew the layout of this house better than I ever would. "Just give me the box, and you can keep the house?" A voice rasped from the darkness of the foyer, a voice that sounded like gravel grinding against rusted iron. I backed away into the library, clutching the lockbox to my chest, my mind racing as I realized that the front and back exits were likely blocked by whoever was hunting me. I could hear him breathing now, a wet and labored sound that moved closer with every passing second, echoing through the empty rooms like a physical presence. I realized then that Mr. Abernathy hadn't died of natural causes in this house, but had been hiding something so valuable that people were willing to wait in the shadows for months just to catch a glimpse of it. I retreated toward the servants' staircase behind the kitchen, my breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps as I heard the man's heavy boots kick over a chair in the library. The house felt like a labyrinth designed to trap me. Every corner a potential hiding spot for a killer, and every door a dead end that led nowhere. I scrambled up the narrow stairs, my knees knocking against the wood, and locked myself in the small sewing room at the end of the hall, leaning my weight against the door as the handle began to turn with a slow and rhythmic pressure. He wasn't trying to kick the door down. He was testing it, savoring the moment of my terror with the patience of a predator who knows its prey has nowhere left to run. That box contains the only proof of what I did to him. The voice whispered through the wood, followed by a low, chilling chuckle that made the blood turn to ice in my veins. I realized that the intruder was likely a relative or a business partner who had been searching for this specific piece of evidence for years, and my purchase of the estate had finally brought it to light. I looked around the room for a weapon or an escape, my eyes landing on the old laundry chute that dropped straight down into the basement's soft pile of discarded linens. It was a narrow, terrifying drop, but it was the only way out of a room that was fast becoming my tomb. I clutched the lockbox under one arm and slid into the metal chute just as the door hinges began to groan under the force of a heavy shoulder. The descent was a blur of cold metal and darkness, ending in a jarring impact against a mountain of old curtains and blankets that cushioned my fall. I didn't wait to catch my breath, but scrambled toward the coal chute window that led out to the driveway, my fingers bleeding as I clawed at the rusted latch. I squeezed through the narrow opening, falling into the wet grass just as I saw the shadow of the man appearing at the top of the basement stairs, his silhouette framed by the light of the hallway. I ran toward my car, fumbling with the keys as the intruder emerged from the front door, his face obscured by a dark hood but his intentions clear in the way he lunged toward me. I threw the car into reverse, the tires screaming against the gravel as I sped away from the property, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror where I could see him standing in the middle of the road, watching me escape. I drove straight to the police station and handed over the lockbox, which contained not money or jewels, but a series of ledgers and a confession that linked the intruder to a decade of systematic fraud and violence. I never spent another night in that house, eventually selling it back to the state. But sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear the sound of a brass key sliding across a wooden floor. I bought the property on Miller Street because I wanted a project, a place where I could tear down the old lath and plaster to reveal the sturdy bones of a house that had stood for nearly a century. The previous owner had been an elderly recluse who hadn't updated the interior since the late 70s, leaving behind layers of peeling floral wallpaper and thick, mustard-colored carpeting that seemed to swallow the sound of my footsteps. On the first night, the house felt strangely oversized, a sprawling skeleton of interconnected rooms that smelled of sawdust, damp earth, and something metallic that I couldn't quite identify. I remember standing in the kitchen with a sledgehammer in my hand, feeling a surge of excitement at the prospect of gutting the pantry to create an open-concept living space, unaware that the walls were holding more than just insulation and copper wiring. The first sign that something was wrong appeared during the second week of demolition, when I noticed that the dimensions of the kitchen didn't quite match the exterior footprint of the house. There was a gap of nearly 4 feet between the back of the pantry and the outer brick wall, a dead space that didn't appear on any of the blueprints I had found in the local records office. I assumed it was simply an architectural quirk, a redundant chimney flue, or perhaps an abandoned dumbwaiter that had been boarded up decades ago to save on heating costs. But as I began to pry away the horizontal slats of wood behind the shelving, I found a small, hinged panel that had been painted over so many times it was almost invisible against the surrounding trim. When the panel finally gave way with a sharp, splintering crack, I didn't find a dusty void or a stack of old newspapers, but a narrow, vertical crawl space that led down into the darkness of the foundation. I shined my flashlight into the opening, the beam cutting through the stagnant air to reveal a small, makeshift living area complete with a sleeping bag, a stack of canned goods, and a collection of Polaroids pinned to the raw timber studs. My blood ran cold as I realized the photos weren't of the previous owner, but of me, taken from various angles through the gaps in the floorboards and the ventilation grates while I was working on the renovations. The realization that someone had been living beneath my feet, watching my every move through the literal cracks in my home, made my stomach churn with a violent, primal sense of violation. I didn't call the police immediately, a mistake born from the arrogant belief that whoever was down there had long since fled when they heard the sound of my power tools. I spent the rest of the evening boarding up the panel with heavy plywood and long deck screws, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped the drill twice in the silence of the empty kitchen. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the construction debris, and the house transitioned from a place of potential into a cage of my own making. I stayed in the living room that night, my back against the front door and a heavy framing hammer resting in my lap, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the radiator and the distant, muffled sound of the wind howling through the eaves. Around 3 in the morning, the silence was broken by a sound that made my heart stop. A slow, deliberate scratching coming from directly beneath the floorboards where I was sitting. It wasn't the sound of a rodent or a shifting foundation, but the unmistakable noise of someone trying to find a way out, their fingernails raking against the underside of the hardwood in a desperate, frantic pattern. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that I hadn't boarded the intruder out of the house. I had trapped him inside the wall cavity, and now he was trying to break through the floor to reach me. I scrambled to my feet, the hammer heavy in my hand, as a single floorboard near the fireplace began to creak and groan under the pressure of a prying tool from below. "I just want to leave," a muffled, gravelly voice whispered from the darkness beneath the floor, the sound so close that it felt like it was vibrating through my own bones. I didn't respond, my breath catching in my throat as I watched the tip of a rusted crowbar slide through the gap between the planks, slowly widening the hole with agonizing precision. He wasn't a ghost or a monster, but a man who had turned the hidden spaces of this house into a sanctuary, a person who knew the secret paths behind the drywall better than I knew my own reflection. The tension in the room was electric, a suffocating pressure that made the air feel too thick to breathe as the floorboard finally snapped upward with a deafening bang. A hand reached through the opening, a pale, scarred hand that gripped the edge of the rug and began to pull a body upward from the depths of the crawl space. I knew that if I stayed to fight, I was gambling my life against a man who had nothing left to lose and a map of the house etched into his mind. I didn't wait for him to clear the hole, but turned and bolted for the back door, my boots sliding on the slick plastic sheeting I had laid down for the renovation. I could hear him behind me, the heavy, wet sound of his movements as he scrambled out of the floor and onto the hardwood, his breathing ragged and filled with a terrifying, focused rage. I reached the mudroom and fumbled with the deadbolt, the metal feeling freezing cold against my sweaty palms as I heard his footsteps pounding through the kitchen. I threw the door open and sprinted out into the rainy night, my feet sinking into the mud of the unfinished garden as I headed for the safety of my truck parked at the curb. I scrambled inside and locked the doors just as a figure emerged from the shadows of the porch, a thin, disheveled man holding the same crowbar he had used to breach the floorboards. He didn't chase me into the street. Instead, he stood there in the pouring rain, looking at the house as if he were mourning a loss, before turning and disappearing into the dense woods that bordered the back of the property. The police arrived 20 minutes later, but the hidden room was empty, containing only the discarded remnants of a life lived in the shadows and the chilling collection of photographs he had taken of me. They found a secondary entrance disguised as a cellar vent, a narrow passage that allowed him to move in and out of the house without ever being seen by the neighbors. I sold the property a month later, unable to look at a wall or a floorboard without imagining the hollow spaces that might be hiding behind them. I moved into a modern apartment with concrete floors and glass walls, a place where there are no secrets and no places for a stranger to hide. But sometimes, when the building settles at night, I still find myself looking at the vents and wondering who might be watching from the other side.